Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. John, some people with elements of perhaps hope or curiosity as to what comes after Acts will notice that we're getting towards potentially the final chapters. Here we are, coming to the end of chapter 23.
Yes, it feels like it does feel like we're hitting a little bit of a moment, and of course as you're getting into the latter parts of the book of Acts, you are getting a sense of the bigness of the narrative. It does, from this moment on, it does feel like it widens out, doesn't it? You know, we've had a lot of early parts around Jerusalem. Then we get some of those mid-book travels. And then we feel like we've been, well, at least me and you probably feel like we've been stuck in Jerusalem and conversations around Paul for the last little while or so. But it's about to expand beyond that. But of course, you do get a sense that the sort of bigness of the story. And I think when you get to the latter chapters, I think there will be a much, even from our probably reflection of it, a much sort of more, not superficial is the wrong word, but we'll be able to move a little bit faster simply because there's lots of just broad details being presented to us.
Yes. Yeah, there's a granularity to this part of the book where you're getting, as you said, levels of detail that we've not seen before in Acts. It's interesting, it's almost following a format similar to all of the Gospels, where if you break most of the Gospels down into thirds, there's lots of years covered in sentences. and then slowly you end up in the Gospels where most of the Gospels, at least the final third, is the last week of Jesus' life.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Acts appeared to have more detail in the early days. But again, still years were sometimes being chunked through in a matter of sentences. And now here we have, in the reading we're going to do today, you're getting the full text of a letter that's being written and real details of movement. So it's definitely, this is drawing together. If Luke is following a pattern similar to the Gospels, coming to the end of our encounters with Paul, he's wanting us to see this in detail.
Yeah, and of course, I think ultimately, without giving too much away for our listeners, although they probably already ahead of us, of course, Paul does end up in Rome, and what's about to go down over the next couple of chapters, or at least next couple of conversations, is going to be the springboard of that. It's going to be the catapult, really, of that. And Paul ends up on a definite, literally fixed trajectory to Rome because he's essentially a prisoner on his way to Rome. So it is a fascinating sort of moment that changes the direction, as it were, of even Paul's own trajectory as he thinks about his future. Yeah.
And so we're reading from verse 23 today down to the end of chapter 23. So 23 onwards.
Yeah.
So Paul, we left him the last time at some threat. The commander of the Romans has heard that there's serious threats against Paul's life, and he's now reacting to and taking this threat seriously, isn't he?
Absolutely, it's fascinating. So we're picking up verse 23. My NIV version starts with, "Then he called two of his centurions," and just to remind our listeners that the he there is the commander, Claudius Lysias. So here we go. "Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them, 'Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix.' He wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias. To His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I have learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace.
So some real legal machinations going on here in this in this movement. We've got Paul with 2 centurions and a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go at nighttime. And this is fascinating, actually. Just to jump straight in, this is a sort of thing that you watch these films sometimes, and they're transporting a prisoner, and I've never seen. I've never seen a group like this transporting the one person.
It's staggering numbers, So to give our listeners a little bit of a reminder here, the single Roman cohort in the context of this situation would have been about 1,000 soldiers. So he's sending off a detachment of 470 soldiers of some description or another.
Yes,
for the protection of one man. I mean, it's quite a serious investment. So, at one level, he is clearly taking this threat to kill him. If the number of men who've taken the vow to kill Paul has been passed on to the Roman commander, well, he's definitely making sure I'm not going to be outnumbered. So 40 men have set themselves up to kill Paul. He's going, okay, we're going to make sure we have plenty of soldiers to fight any threat along the road, and you've got 470, and I loved I just loved a little detail from Dr. Luke that he just provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken. I like that. It's that little detail. Did Paul walk with the detachment? Did he ride with the detachment? But here's the commander going, right, okay, let's get this man on the back of a horse. Maybe because he looked at Paul and thought he wasn't up to it, or maybe they just wanted to move fast. But it's a remarkable commitment. And when you slow that down and set it against the size of the cohort based in Jerusalem, then it is a fairly significant investment into the protection of this Roman citizen.
Yes, because as you say, more than 40. The text says more than 40 people. So you would have to assume that's around 40.
Around 40.
Have taken this solemn vow to not eat, actually. So, quite says something that you've got 470 men defending against around 40 who haven't had their dinner, and they're here to try and take Paul. But yeah, it's interesting, and like little quirks that we see. They've got 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen. And then actually this other thing the NIV translates as spearmen. It's a really strange Greek phrase of right hand men, or people that take with the right. So they're actually, no one's really sure what these soldiers were. And the guess is they're holding something in their right hand. And hence why we've gone probably either bowmen or spearmen of some sort. And they're good, but they're also, the other thing I thought was interesting is they're going at nighttime.
Indeed.
two things that strikes me. Traveling at night is the least safe time of day to travel, in most worlds, to be fair, but definitely in that world. So the urgency of their need to move fast, I think, is to be heard here.
Absolutely.
That's how I am understanding this, that they do not want to still be in town by tomorrow morning.
Indeed. And probably the risk of traveling at night is outweighed by the fact, because they're moving fast and they've made a very, very quick decision to get Paul out, the chances are the conspirators against Paul aren't quite ready for that. They're not. That's probably taken them by surprise, to be fair.
Yes.
Because it's probably the last thing they would expect a Roman commander to do is to act in such haste to protect we know he's a Roman citizen, but he's also a Jew. So they probably expected him to go, not take it so seriously, or perhaps think, well, there's no way they're gonna get Paul while he's under our command. But this action is probably as much about surprising the conspirators as it is about getting Paul out quickly. So it is quite a daring thing, and again, it shows to me the level that of seriousness the commander is taking this, that he's allocated a huge contingent of his cohort to protect this man. But secondly, they're doing it at night, which for horses and for men, let alone from any attack from bandits or brigands or whatever. I mean, just on a horse at night on the roads that they had, or walking at night on the roads that they had, you're increasing your own level of risk and injury, and so it's a very, very significant investment, and it's a very significant commitment. And the little reflection I had on that, David, was I don't know about you, I was really struck by the fact that this Roman commander seems to be taking a really serious interest in Paul. Now, we can reflect on why we think that is, but I love the providential nature of this. I love the fact that this is a guy that has probably saved Paul's life twice already, if we're tracking. So, he rescued him from the temple precinct. I know they were going to brutalize him themselves in order to torture and get information out of him. But he's rescued Paul from the temple precinct. He rescued Paul from the riotous situation in the Sanhedrin, when the Sanhedrin came together, and pulled him out of that. And in both cases, his life seemed to be under threat. And now he is investing serious energy getting Paul away. And I love this thought, David, and I love the irony of this thought, that it's a Roman soldier who is taking a serious interest in Paul for whatever reason, and that becomes God's providential protection of Paul. That this protection is coming from the most unusual source, and maybe for unusual reasons, but Paul is benefiting from that. And I love the thought, the sort of backstory thought, that the Lord is just at work, even in the heart of a Roman, even in the hands of a Roman, even through the legal status that all of that offers, and somehow he's even using that to get Paul to where he needs to go. That lovely providential sense of guidance towards.
I found myself pondering on a broad level, particularly as we come towards the end of all of the writings that we have from Luke. I think he navigates a really fascinating line when it comes to the Romans and any of the authorities in the empire, for want of a better term. It's interesting how, and maybe we need to learn from this, John. I don't want to try and lay it on too thick, but I feel the need to learn from this myself, that Luke can see the people in the middle of a system. So you have a centurion, and a commander here, doing right by Paul as best as they can, right? While Luke is still criticizing. There's still a critique here, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But it reminded me that Luke is also, as are the gospel writers generally, happy to have a centurion at the cross of Jesus proclaiming, surely this was a righteous man. So the individuals within the empire Luke can see them, right? He can see who they are and see them away from this kind of murderous empire that they're part of. I think there's something beautiful to take note on there, that what empire does is kind of monochrome everyone into a big, and we do this a lot in the modern world. The British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Russians, whatever. And Luke seems to avoid doing that. Here he has a commander, right? And then when we zoom right the way into this human, we see this human in some ways a little stuck. And you see the stuckness in that, he's sending Paul over to Felix, and as you read in the letter, he's like, I don't think he's done anything, but there's chaos going on here that I can't fix, so I'm sort of passing it on. So you see, let me say it like this: you see that the empire is unable to do what Jesus preaches about in the Nazareth synagogue. The empire cannot bring justice, because it's very interesting. This commander, he knows what justice is. This man's not done anything. I can't. It's something to do with their law, which again is a little ham-fisted, right, in terms of his description. But I can't see that he's done anything even deserving imprisonment, much less death. But Paul's not free. Right? So this notion that the machinery of these big things will always lose the individual somewhat. And Luke's almost in a subtle way tells the story, showing that the gospel, Jesus can hear a centurion with faith. A centurion can proclaim Jesus is righteous at the cross. The gospel can see the person, not the machine. Maybe I'm laying that on too thick, John, but I feel like Luke's done that a few times to us.
Oh, for sure. I think that's a gorgeously deliberate and intentional golden thread of Luke throughout both his gospel and the book of Acts. I mean, I think we've alluded to that before, but these unusual characters are not only sort of bit part players in the narrative, but they're brought in some cases right into the center of a particular moment in story. And of course, big picture, we're remembering that the book of Acts, as we understand it, that document is being written to Theophilus, potentially an influential, if he was an influential Roman citizen. And the letter to Theophilus becomes a magnificent apologetic. It becomes a defense, in fact, of the gospel. And you're getting, I mean, imagine writing from the other side of the world to a British audience, and every now and again you're mentioning, there was this really good guy, this good woman, this British person who helped us, this British person who did this, and you're reading that as an outsider to the story, but you keep hearing semi-favorable or even intentionally and dynamically favorable references being made of people that are like you, people that are that in many ways both represent you or even you would totally identify with. So I love this idea that actually these characters are being threaded in, and I've come to like this commander. There's some now. There's just like it's just like totally John Andrews subjectivity. But I'm going, actually, we've seen Roman officials caught in difficult moments before, and they haven't really acted with as well as they could have done. The classic one is Pilate, of course, with Jesus and the whole shenanigans that goes on there. This man's in a deeply difficult position, and yet you feel like he's trying to do constantly the right thing. He's trying to help. Now, he's doing that as a commander, but of course, what I love as we zoom out, he's doing this almost providentially, guided by the hand of God. Gently guided, of course, by the hand of God. There's no claim here, and there's nothing explicit in the text, but you do get this lovely sense of it is the gentle moving of the Holy Spirit at work here, even to cause the commander to do what he does? Or is this just the commander doing what he does, and you sort of pay your money, take your choice on that. But I think there's something really gorgeous here, that this man now, this is the third occasion in which he has intervened, and each time he's intervened, it's for the protection or betterment of Paul. And in this gorgeously ironic way, the empire itself, humanized through this commander Claudius Lysias, has become a friend of the gospel. He's become a friend of the spread of the gospel, even though on the surface of it, he's just doing his job.
And I think that's what I think is interesting about how Luke presents things to us, that he never presents the empire as the friend, but there are people within the empire who can come. The Philippian jailer, the humans. I love this about the whole story, that humans are always seen and preserved as individuals, not as groups. And I was thinking even about, and this is a sort of classic two text comment that I'll make here, that I'm not 100% confident Luke is intentionally showing us this, but I was struck when I was reading this, or when you were talking about this reading just now, that just recently in church we read the follow-up from Jesus' appearance in the Nazareth synagogue in Luke chapter 4. And I was just struck as you were reading there, that in that situation a mob appears again, and they're very unhappy at something Jesus has said, and they're going to throw him off a cliff. And it says, and Jesus just walks through the crowd and leaves. It struck me just now that Jesus and the power of the Spirit is never overly worried about a crowd. If he actually needs to and wants to, he can just wander through the crowd, and they're out there baying for his blood, and he just leaves. So Jesus and the gospel are never actually subjected to the powers of the crowd, right? So in this situation, even the great empire, somebody within it actually helps the gospel.
Yes.
But you also see in this narrative the inability of the empire to actually deal with the crowd. Right? So there's this mob. There are accusations of something to do with their law, but there's no charge against him that deserves death or imprisonment. But the empire, all the power of the empire, can't get Paul out of jail. Right? They can't get Paul out of jail, even though their own laws have not been broken. And then it struck me that final line, and I might be reading too much into this, so please, listeners, take that in mind. That final line, "Oh, I'll hear your case when your accusers get here." Like they do all this nighttime runaway with all these soldiers, and the net result is, well, let's wait for them all to catch up. Right? And there's this sense that you're almost seeing there's a potential thread there of the empire's inability to protect Paul, in the same way that God is actually the one protecting Paul. So God can stir the hearts of individuals to do what he needs to be done to protect Paul. But all of this power of the Roman Empire and a group of 40 hungry men, they can't deal with them. And I can't help but think Luke, at least, even if he doesn't intend us to see that critique, would be okay with us seeing that critique. That this centurion, this commander, these can be good people. These can be people who are trying to do good in the midst of a rough situation. And I think, and I wanted to sort of ask you questions about this, but I was struck reading this letter to sort of jump from that question about the way that the empire is. I was struck by verse 27. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I was struck by how flat that sentence was.
Yes.
Right? We are... So here's my two thoughts really are. We know Paul really, really well now from reading Acts. I mean, we the reader. And the best that we can deserve is, oh, he's a Roman. That's all we've got to say about him. And he doesn't even get a name. He's just this man, right? And I thought, isn't it interesting that that's what the powers of the world so often do? is they boil people down, right? Governments do this all the time. You're just the problem, So I've spoke to people that are looking for, help with housing or help with their health, and they just become, in the eyes of the machine, a person with a housing problem, a disabled person perhaps, or and then somebody else might do something wrong and they just become a criminal, right? There's something about us just being narrowed down to one description that I think is very classically what we do. And we do it with our enemies. We do it with people we don't like. But I was struck by how then this, and again, I'm not saying Luke intends us to see this, but I was struck by the fact when the God of the universe speaks to Saul and Paul, he calls him by name twice.
Yeah, come on.
So to the empire, he's this man, and the only real thing we can say about him is he's Roman.
Yeah.
But to God, he is Saul. And I think there's something to ponder upon there, even if Luke maybe, I don't know. I'm not brave enough to say what Luke intends us or doesn't intend us to think.
Sure. I think it's a valid reflection. It's a gorgeous contrast moment at the very least. You've got, as you said, we're intimately involved in the life of Paul at this stage, and we feel like we sort of know him. But of course, now we're recognizing that he's been sent to a man called Felix, who may or may not know who he is, although we find out a bit later Felix seems to be quite acquainted with the way. So that's fascinating. But certainly the Roman commander has no idea who he was. He thought he was an Egyptian terrorist sort of thing to begin with. So you get all of these sort of contrasts. And you get this sort of, Paul is being reduced down to this anonymity. He's almost now an anonymous person. The only thing that causes him to stand out in the eyes of the Roman commander, at least officially, legally, is the fact he's a citizen of Rome. So, okay, it's on the basis that he's a citizen of Rome that I'm sending him to you. Now, that might be disguising some feelings this commander has towards Paul. It might be disguising the fact this man has been struck by Paul's courage, bravery, clarity, the fact that Paul has managed himself profoundly well in the midst of unbelievable provocation, and never once sort of given the Romans themselves a hard time. I mean, this is bound to have had some sort of impact. I'm not saying a faith impact, but just a human impact on the commander. The commander will have seen all sorts of shapes and sizes and all sorts of weird and wonderful, and he will have had to have dealt with just a range of just abuse and opinions, directly or indirectly leveled at him. Paul doesn't seem to do any of that. And whether all of that's going as part of the backstory, hence the reason the commander is so committed, or it could be the commander is committed to Paul's well-being simply because he is a Roman citizen. But that contrast of the intimacy between the commander and Paul up to this point, at least in name terms, and then the fact that Paul is referred to simply as a man and a Roman citizen, shows again the sort of dehumanizing, the sort of de-individualization that's going on here. This is reducing Paul down to lowest common denominator. He is simply a Roman citizen. In one of my devotional reflections this morning, I was thinking about the story of Hagar, and when the Lord appears to Hagar, and in one of the few occasions where a person names God in the scriptures, like names him, we have Hagar calling the Lord El Roi, the God who sees me, the God, the seeing God, and I love the fact that when the Lord comes to her, he sees the intimacy of her world. He calls her, he speaks to her. There's an awareness of the details of her life and what she needs to do. And as a result of that, her response is, oh my goodness, you've really, really, really seen me. It's not that I'm just a woman on the side of the road. You really have seen me. So however the Lord speaks to her and whatever he says to her causes this woman to feel deeply valued and deeply seen and valued to such an extent she is prepared to go back to the sort of abusive context that she's sort of come out of within that. And I love the contrast there. I love the fact that whatever's going on in the commander's heart, whatever he is or isn't seeing in Paul, at the very lowest common denominator, he's seeing Paul as a Roman citizen. That's it. Let's get this man off my hands. He's a Roman citizen. Pass him down the road. Whether he's had any other interaction. But of course, then layered on top of this story, we're seeing the God of heaven who knows everything about Paul, who knows where he needs to be, what he needs to do, where he needs to go, and knows the details of Paul's life. And somehow we see these two magnificent and contrasting ideas layered together. One of dehumanization, depersonalization, de-individualizing the person. And then on the other side, you've got the God of heaven who knows Paul's name, knows everything about him, knows all the details, and we would argue is providentially, gently, and sometimes not so gently guiding Paul to the place where he wants him to go. And I think the contrast is well worthy of reflection, David. Whether Luke intended that or not, well, we don't know exactly what's in Luke's head, but he writes in these sorts of ways continuously. There is a pattern in Luke's writing where he is often contrasting various moments, various people, and various worldviews that are colliding together. And I think this is a beautiful collision of worldviews, of the dehumanization of Paul to a man, and yet we know him as the apostle sent by God to the Gentile nations. So it's very powerful contrast.
And as you say, I think that's a great way to think about it, that this is a theme within Paul, the intimate God. No, not within Paul, sorry. This is a theme within Luke. This intimate God, the God who knows. And I think it's likely that that's so core to Luke's idea of God that it sort of just leaks out in all sorts of other places. And of course, it's also very apparent that the systems and processes, Luke is not afraid to be critical of their failings. And you look at when he criticizes the medical system that leaves the poor woman destitute because it can't help her. It just made her worse. I think everything is contrast to Jesus for Luke, isn't it? Everything is contrast to the work of God. And I think there's something beautiful for us in this as well, to not fantasize about the power of the state. I often think this when I'm reading Acts, that at this particular point in world history, there's a lot of things seem to hang on the edge of things. And I have no desire to be a scaremonger, John. That's not my intention when I say this. But there's a tendency sometimes to fantasize, if this country can just get its act together, or if that country can just get its act together, or so on and so forth. And I feel like Acts speaks to us in the 21st century and sort of reminds us, let me say it about Paul here. Paul is in God's hands. Paul is not, Jesus is in God's hands. He can walk through the crowd if he needs to walk through the crowd. I think all the gospel writers want to see that. Jesus ends up on the cross, ultimately because that's God's plan. That's the plan that Jesus has submitted to. And yes, we can, show how the powers failed in that process and did actually make it happen. But I mean, John's gospel is very clear off. If Jesus didn't want it to happen, it isn't happening. And I think there's this invitation in this language to trust, as Paul does, to trust the God that holds him. And why the church's response to all the things in the world that are going on should be to pray, should be to ensure that our own hearts realize that everything's in God's hands. And that's not, I'm not rolling out therefore everything that happens is exactly as God wants it. We can see in Acts that that's not always the case of things. The world has its broken narratives that unfortunately are not going to be fixed until the resurrection. But ultimately, we still can trust ourselves to the providential hands of God in these things. And I really like that Luke leaves that there, because as we'll see in the next chapter, there are moments where the politics get in the way a little bit, and and the powers chicken out from doing what is right and what is just. And thank goodness when things are unjust, we, like Paul, can say, "Oh, but God knows my name."
Absolutely. And I would say Luke is reminding us that what empire cannot deliver, the kingdom of God can deliver. And what the emperor or the commander or the governor can or cannot do, that ultimately the king and his ability and power and providential loving kindness and care can deliver, both for us and for his ultimate glory.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.